get new feedback and new perspectives on their work. So I think it's with COVID also we were working like for example at BRAC, the platform that that I run with a couple of our core members. One of our members actually had to relocate back to the States. So actually now a lot of our projects, which we initially discussed, had to be reimagined in terms of the format and how we even discuss as a team and how do we actually manifest the project in Singapore, So I think it definitely has affected a lot of our work, and also another project which you mentioned earlier, which is Uba Rumah, is actually a project that I'm working on with my collaborator Ernest, who is currently also based in
installation, and it's necessary to travel because it's a physical interactive installation, so I had to be there. So other times I traveled was to attend conferences, not because of installing anything, just to attend like advantage of networking. Then the playing field is more leveled. Because like previously, if I couldn't afford the time or money to travel there, then I miss out. There's a FOMO, because if there's this thing happening in San Francisco, this conference in Facebook conference, and then I don't pay the money, and it's not cheap to attend these conferences. I think it was like $500, and then plus the ticket, and then plus you have to block out 1 week of time. Then if you cannot afford that, you actually miss out on a lot. But I guess if now there's nobody can go to the conference, there's no such conference, then there's no FOMO also. So I guess there's less stress for me to do that.
Right. So I mean, if for the benefit of everyone, FOMO is actually fear of missing out, right? All right. So how about Shubigi? How about you? I mean, clearly traveling is very much essential in your work. How has the limitation sort of impacted your role as a curator, as an artist, and a writer as well?
Thank you, Zul. I think the ways in which it's affected my work, of course, as you said, is very different depending on what we're speaking about. As an artist, I think the effect has been much worse because almost all the work that I was doing as an artist involved location shoots, none of which can happen for we don't know how long now. So it's not just a question of all the cancellations that happened, but also the fact that a lot of these projects are grant-based or are based on institutional funding of some sort. And deferments for that is very difficult. And restarting international location shoots is, again, it's a whole ball of wax. It's not that easy to restart those things. As a curator, I was really lucky. I was almost at the end of my curatorial research. I'd just done a year of travel, and I think I just had a couple of destinations left when COVID really hit. So I got back, as a matter of fact, a week before circuit breaker came into effect in Singapore, and I was really lucky that way. I have colleagues who were stranded in Australia where I was, and also in Japan and places like that. I think the difficult part is trying to curate at distance because I can't get into India. I haven't been able to get in since I think February last year, almost a year now. So a lot of on-ground work can't be done. And if you're not there and you're not working with your team in the same room, the pace of work is very different. The sort of energy that's required to actually do a biennale, which is quite an exercise, that energy is missing if you do it just virtually. So I do think it's essential sometimes to travel for certain things. I feel at the same time that it's a lot of us were used to, those of us that were able to and had the opportunities and the means and the privilege to do so, were, I think, traveling more than was really needed. I'm quite happy actually to cut down on the amount of traveling that I will do even when things stabilize a bit. I don't think it's necessary to actually go to travel so much, but I really do miss the intellectual isolation that does kick in when you haven't you're not able to travel for research, you're not able to travel for production. I really do miss that as an artist and a writer. So I think it's funny because one would imagine as a curator I'd be more affected, but actually not so much.
I mean, it's quite apt that you're mentioning about missing out certain things, because actually I'm also wondering, what are we then embracing, right, with the fact that there are these restrictions, but it can still be quite generative. But what are we also missing, Alecia?
I think one of the things that I did observe is that okay, there's one thing that I think the online sort of traveling, right, via the internet cannot quite offer, which is actually presence, right? So I think it's interesting to think about how we can bring in the things that we value into this online interactions. Yeah, because one thing right now with technology, right, we're allowed to be very precise. So we are actually hyper organized. So for example, now if I want to have a digital residency, I want to have a meeting, I actually have to plan a lot. And there's no way to sort of meet without an agenda, right? Once you open Zoom, it's like, okay, this is our meeting notes, we have to do all this. So I think we lose a little bit of that sort of allowing people to get to know each other slowly. How sort of like allowing the relationship to unfold, which then to me is also interesting because we can choose, right? We can choose how we want to engage. We can mute, or you can type, you can use verbal. So I think a lot of visual and verbal aspects are prioritized, which also sometimes might marginalize certain people who don't speak the same language, or they don't have certain experiences that you can already sort of predict. So in a way, we become even more siloed in certain circumstances. So I think props to the organizers who are actually thinking about this quite consciously when they organize digital events or residency programs, because I think everyone's learning as we go along. So there are certain things which I believe can be definitely improved, so that the digital experience can actually offer something to help us prep rather than be a replacement, because it really is very distinct experiences. Yeah.
Which is also quite ironic, because as much as we are, I mean, the virtual actually enables us to connect, we are also at the same time quite siloed, right? Like what you mentioned. How about Eugene? Anything that you're embracing from this, or anything that you're missing?
Something I'm embracing is the change. So we are coming up with new etiquette for this online stuff. Like for example, now I hear some wind sound. I'm not sure it's from Shubigi's mic. Maybe you might want to try to mute your mic. Is your mic mute? So this kind of like social etiquette is new. This kind of thing like, oh, can you please mute your mic? I hear some wind sound. So this kind of change is a language that we'll all develop together moving forward. I think so. We'll be embracing all this, law.
I mean, also at the same time, like a lot of things has shifted as well, right? Because I mean, previously with the fact that traveling allowed us to actually go out there and connect. Right now, I mean, as much as it sounds cliche, we are sort of like looking inward. So I'm just wondering. It seems as if restrictions has also shifted the way we see things that are on the margins and things that are on the center. And what I'm really like referring to right now is, do you feel there is a redirected attention to things that are happening locally due to the restrictions of travel? Yeah.
I think definitely there's been a surge of that interest, right? I mean, even building towards the period when we had the lockdown, there was already sort of this. I'm speaking in a Singapore context. I think there's been interest in sort of like community arts, or like placemaking. These are sort of terms which have now entered the mainstream, right? So I think even more so now, with everyone being stuck here physically, there's a lot more initiatives that are happening on the ground. So I guess my main sort of question as a artist myself, right, is while a lot of us are kind of in survival mode also, we are grateful and thankful for these opportunities to work, right, to practice. But at the same time, I think there's still a lot of emphasis on production. Yeah, so I think with this shift to the local, there are a lot of benefits, but I think we need to be also quite mindful about what, where are we going with all this, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, so I think it'll be great to think about these initiatives as long-term investments for the artist practice. So sort of, it's been said a lot before, but I think now is the perfect time to actually put it into practice. Can we actually move away from overproduction and actually invest in research? Allow, still have these fellowships where artists are being supported, but allow them to have time to grow their projects. Yeah.
Eugene, how about you? And what do you think of this redirected attention, if it's applicable to your position as an artist?
Yeah, I'm certainly getting quite a few projects that are locally, and there's also a few overseas projects, which I think otherwise I may or may not have gotten. Like overseas, like for example, I finished a project for a company in London, and then they probably might have preferred someone local if if it was still like pre-COVID time where you could still meet up with people. But since now they are all working from home anyway, all the staff there, they decided to engage someone overseas. So I managed to probably got that project because of this social change that happened. So I've had 3 major overseas projects now with overseas companies, which probably otherwise would have gotten local creators to do for them.
I just want to also just perhaps shift a little bit in terms of the question, because often, when we think about traveling, or at least for artists, we think about, artists seeking out new knowledge. You were mentioning about research earlier. Maybe Shubigi would have a comment on this. Often, traveling is mystified, and it is also quite symbolic, right? So at the same time, the pervasiveness of traveling has also maybe contributed to a sense of hierarchy in terms of what knowledge is valued, and sometimes to a point where certain knowledge are seen more superior depending on where you actually get them. So also maybe echoing, or rather extending the whole question on local and global. Maybe Shubigi, what do you think? Do you feel that the pervasiveness of traveling has contributed to a sense of hierarchy in the way we address knowledge or seeking knowledge?
Thank you for that question, but I'm not wholly sure about hierarchies of knowledge here. I think a lot of it has to do with optics and the way people project certain opportunities that they've gained. Because to be very honest, travel again is something that comes from means, privilege, ability, and people who can't sort of access these opportunities are definitely at a disadvantage because it's sort of counted against them. I'll give a simple example. It's easier for me actually to speak about myself rather than about a particular person, though there are numerous examples there. My very first residency was actually 12 years into my practice. I did not do a residency before that for a number of reasons, but the first one that I did was actually in Singapore, and it was at NTU CCA, and it's after that I've done more so-called prestigious residencies, like the one-year one in the Bethanien in Berlin. But I'll tell you very honestly, the best residency I ever did was at CCA. And the reason for that is very simple. It's the way the residency was set up. So on paper, it may be like, ooh, okay, Britannia, this or that. But very, very honestly, the most valuable research, the most valuable knowledge access, the best resource access, and also the relationships that have really materialized into concrete projects, and I'm talking about relationships with fellow artists, but also visiting curators, was at CCA. Part of it was the way the residency program was set up. You had curators coming in for just 2 weeks, but the artists were in residence for 3 months. So you got to meet people from all over the world. But also, interestingly enough, there was a lot of Southeast Asian access. Now, as someone who's not born here, my understanding of the region will always be, tentative. Part of it has to do, I think, with my sort of feeling that I'm always an interloper or an outsider. This residency did a lot to break that. So when you talk about hierarchies of knowledge, I actually would like to argue against the idea of hierarchy, because localness is a problematic term too. What's really local for me? I always, when I think of Singapore, I think of the region. I think of our biggest neighbor, Indonesia, in particular, and I think of course, naturally, the geopolitics of Southeast Asia and so on. And all of this thinking that happened and this exposure that happened at CCA in 2016 actually stood me in very good stead for a lot of the thinking that I had to do as a curator for South Asia. So because I was looking at the relationship between South and Southeast Asia in particular. So I went back to a lot of the ideas that had germinated at that time. So sometimes it can be really useful to actually look at what's right in your backyard. So I agree with Alecia about a lot of what she said as well. To go back to hierarchies of knowledge though, I think we have to acknowledge that there is a kind of if I may say, almost snobbery concerning certain types of opportunities and projects, especially for a certain type of contemporary artist. I think it's also important to focus on the way curators travel, for instance, because that's a wholly different form of knowledge making, and not often with it doesn't always show the same tangible results, in the sense that it doesn't always have that kind of deep dive effect that a residency for an artist can have. So I think that I'm glad in a way that the idea of travel has been disrupted and tied up to this whole idea of how you gain knowledge or how you research. And even though it's affected me very badly, I mean, it's definitely had, I mean, my work has suffered. But at the same time, in a larger sense, I'm glad that we have a more level playing field. Because if you're disabled, if you don't have the means, and you are cut out of or not part of the opportunities that are possible, then I think it's really unfair. And I realized this when I was doing my curatorial travel for Kochi as well. A lot of the places that I went to in Latin America, for instance, the artists, fantastic work, and gaining a name for themselves in their own countries, but completely unknown outside of that location because it didn't have the means or the opportunities to travel. So I think we first should recognize that being here based in Singapore, we do have access to a bit more than a fair number of people do. But I also think that it's a great opportunity to contest what constitutes hierarchies of knowledge making, what constitutes positions in the art world, vis-a-vis your I'm going to say this as a curator of a biennale, but vis-a-vis your exposure and how many biennales you get to do in a given time frame, how many prestigious residencies you've done, where you're invited to give talks. I think a lot of these things can be shifted and changed, and they are already happening. So in a sense, it's a pity it took a pandemic for this to happen. But I am glad that we had this opportunity to rethink the necessity of, tying up a perceived worth or value of an artist, which is just a disgusting idea, along with your means and ability to travel.
Right, exactly. Because like I think like to just echo whatever Shubigi just mentioned, this idea of traveling is also symbolic because to be able to travel, to have a certain sense of mobility, it also sort of contributes, right, to the image of an artist. Alecia, maybe you have a comment on this idea of
Yeah.
knowledge from elsewhere and the local. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking. I think what Shubigi shared also resonated with me because I was thinking about like how even though we may think that the playing field has been equalized, right, given technology, but the truth is, some places even the basic access to broadband is limited, and that has actually concretely created problems in some of the projects I'm working on right now. So previously we were able to have this sort of really seamless collaboration across the causeway, right? Sometimes in Singapore we also host some of our artist friends to do workshops in Singapore. So it has always been like that. And then now, even though we are so close, as neighbors, we can't even cross that hurdle. And this has real impact on people's livelihoods, which is why I was emphasizing, even though, I mean, it might be on certain organizations' minds that, okay, we can cut costs because traveling is, not possible now. But actually, I think we still need to honor the fees or like stipends for digital fellowships, in a way that's sustainable for artists to continue also, because this is really, the traveling is not just about the privilege, but it is livelihood also for certain artists. They actually need to travel to sustain their practice in some ways. Yeah, so so that's something that I wanted to share. Yeah.
So if we were to think of things that way, if previously maybe some certain group of people don't have the privilege to travel, not just because of financial situations, but because of certain commitments, the fact that you need to survive, you have to be on the ground to sort of produce, and you can't travel, right, because you don't have the privilege to do so. Do you feel then perhaps with the pandemic everyone is sort of like in a more equal position? Maybe Eugene, what are your thoughts?
So recently, at the first part in January in 2020, I traveled to Bali on behalf of this boy who has brittle bones. He had an exhibition in Bali, but he can't take the flight because he has brittle bones. He's 10 years old. So I traveled there to shoot his exhibition and the opening in virtual reality. This episode was on Channel News Asia. Then I flew back, edited the video together, and then let him experience what it was like at his opening in Bali. So yeah, I guess it really does kind of level the playing field for people like him, brittle bones and cannot travel. What I tried to do when I could travel was to travel on his behalf. So I guess what everyone is saying now is really kind of leveling the playing field for people like him.
I think Shubigi, are you still there? All right. Okay. Maybe we can. Yep. Okay. There you
Yes.
are. All right. Okay. I kind of want to also perhaps maybe as a creative provocation, especially Shubigi, considering the fact that you're also a curator and the curator for the Kochi Muziris Biennale that's happening, right? Or rather postponed, but eventually happening. Often when we think about curators, right, or and how we connect that to traveling, often curators seem to be the one that is traveling more, right, than artists, because usually when artists travel, apart from residencies, they also travel if they are participating in perhaps biennales or certain exhibitions overseas, right? And of course, there is sort of a discussion that with curators traveling quite extensively, it may not be environmentally sustainable, right? In that sense. So, but at the same time, curators are also dependent upon, right, for brokering connections and also for connecting networks or sort of like providing that networks for younger artists. So based on, I mean, this question is for everyone, but we can begin with Shubigi. But based on your respective roles, where do you see yourself in this chain of events? Shubigi?
Yes. So, first thing I want to say is that I actually hesitate to call myself a curator because this is actually my first proper gig as a curator. And the reason for that is because the Kochi Muziris Biennale is always curated by an artist. So I want to foreground that very clearly that this role that I'm performing at the moment is actually simply because I'm an artist, not because I've had professional training in curatorial studies or so on, because I haven't. So when I speak about the role of a curator, it is solely based on my experience, and also my experience as an artist working with curators who have traveled and so on. I think there's a lot of there's a bit of a guessing game involved when curators travel. The first thing is that, because I've always noticed this, most curators get very little time in to wherever it is they're going for multiple reasons, and they have to depend on one or two in particular local guides or introductions into the local scene, which means that if you know the right people, you get to meet curators. Otherwise, you just don't. So I want to also say that this happens more frequently than people care to admit, perhaps. And I've been on both sides of this, so I know this now. Who you're affiliated with, your network, and so on, always comes into play. And again, it can be quite a closed loop, and you can see this demonstrated when you have Biennale curators, for instance, who travel because they have to do hectic travel in a very short time for most of 2019, and a little bit of 2020. I actually was catching a flight every 3 days, and that's also, first of all, very damaging to the environment. I've been very miserable about that, because I've been thinking a lot about how to make things more sustainable anyway. And I also think that a lot of this can be there are other ways to do this. But not only that, it takes a toll on your on your work and on the way you function as a machine, as a body. And I think what also happens is that you have to rely very heavily on your local your local guide, so to speak, the person who's your intro into the local scene, which again means that you're dealing with a very, very narrow field. And for all your best intentions, and I had these intentions of going beyond the usual, you'll find that you end up meeting the same old people who introduce you to the same artists, and so on and so forth, and you see the same sort of rhetoric or narratives that you've already seen in biennales and so on. So this was, even though I consciously tried very hard to work past that, there was only one region where I was able to do that, and that's actually, interestingly, that was again Latin America. And that was again because of a person who's locally based, who's based here, who I knew here, and she's the one, when we had extensive conversations, she's the one who gave me these sort of pathways into discovering things that were so-called off the beaten track. And I wouldn't have been able to do that if I didn't know someone locally here in Singapore. So I want to emphasize that sometimes when we talk about traveling to curate, there are multiple things that are involved. And again, it can be quite exclusionary. Curators do make a huge effort, I think, to get past the whole, or the usual circuit of people, but you can see it replicated again and again. If you look at actually biennales or big international projects, you'll see, or important international residencies, you'll see the same names crop up again and again. So this becomes its own form of canonization. And it's a very dangerous thing to a certain extent, especially when you're dealing with scenes that have different forms of artistic practices and thinking practices that don't always fit in well in the spectacle of a biennale, for instance. But then the people who get replicated, who doing that cycle, they're the ones who then regarded as being at the forefront of contemporary practice. And these are again not ideas that we should be comfortable with. We should disrupt this. I'm really hoping that things will get disrupted a bit more, and that people will have the time to slow down and really look at regions, if they're working with regions outside of their own, but also I think have conversations with people they weren't able to meet earlier. Again, I always, despite my tendency towards pessimism, I always end up coming off more idealistic and optimistic than perhaps I should be. But I don't think I'm yet jaded enough with all this crazy travel. And I also have to say, I've been traveling extensively and very, I think, very, very badly for the planet for 8 years now. Mainly for my own work, and this is definitely something that I'm trying to change. I think that to come back to what you had brought up, I think it's definitely a provocation. I think as I said, it's also an opportunity. There are certain things that don't function well digitally, though, and I think if you're talking about a biennale, just having an online biennale is a really bad idea. It is a terrible disservice to works that don't translate well into a digital or virtual format. But keeping that in mind, that's the challenge, I think, to curators. How do you also not just look at the digital or the virtual as a tool, but how do you look at it as something that can elevate a practice? A lot of the artists that I'm working with for the Biennale have actually relished the opportunity to change the way they normally work. They couldn't do production on site. Their studios were closed down. They can't travel if they need to for the work. So they had to, and we're talking about even established artists, they had to change the way they think and work. This is something that could only have happened because I, as the curator, was very keen that we just start off from scratch, even though that meant, in a sense, it created a lot of disruption, to be very honest. All the budgets had to be redone, every project renegotiated, but it's been absolutely worth it, because you cannot do the talk unless you actually try and say, okay, fine, I have this opportunity, let me try and, even though I think caused a lot of sleepless nights for a lot of people. Let's just try and see if we can change things up a bit.
Right, thank you, Shubigi. I just kind of want to pick up something that Shubigi mentioned earlier about certain works not translating sort of well digitally, right? So maybe Eugene, I was wondering, with how, technology is allowing us to, create virtual worlds and, very much interesting interfaces. Do you feel that as time goes by, we'll be too comfortable with the fact that, we find ourselves not having a need to be present, what do you think?
Being too comfortable, I think it's okay to be more comfortable with not meeting. I guess if it stops the spread of COVID, then we should encourage being more comfortable. But there is still a loss of human interaction, which will be dearly missed, of course. Back then, your question is very interesting, because back then in 2013, I made a virtual gallery where I tried to recreate the whole gallery visiting experience, where you go there and you see the people who are there at the same time and can try to talk with them. Then after that experiment in 2013, I realized that instead of trying to recreate the human interaction, because that is not possible, I tried my best, and the most I could translate was to have their voices transmit through the mic, and maybe some of their pictures or some of their videos like Zoom like that. So that was the most. So instead of trying to recreate the whole human interaction, I played up instead the digital advantages. The digital advantages where like previously I tried to make it such that you have to walk around the gallery, then you can see the people there. This is like this is kind of what you have to do in real life. You walk around the gallery. If someone's behind a wall, you don't see them until you go behind the wall. So I tried to recreate all that. So instead of trying to recreate that kind of thing, for the next project, I just made it such that everybody can see everybody all the time, which is like how Zoom was. And I thought that was that made more sense moving forward. And then I guess 7 years later, COVID hit, and now suddenly that the experiment and whatever I found out in the experiment is applicable now.
Right. How about Alecia? I mean, the fact that your practice also heavily depend on, authentic human interactions in real time. Like how do you feel? Like, have you sort of adapted with the fact that with how we can't sort of maybe conduct certain workshops? How have you sort of adapted to the new normal in that sense? Yeah.
I guess for me personally, and also with my collaborators at BRAC, right, I think one thing we have been thinking a lot about is how do we be a lot more transparent about precisely the problems and the vulnerabilities that we are going through. So we are also experimenting with sort of revealing and talking through these vulnerabilities in the work that we've been creating during this time. Yeah, so we've got this ongoing research called To Gathering, where we're looking at different forms of assembly. And then interestingly enough, we were looking at this last year, a little bit before COVID happened. And then so this was timely, right? To think about, what forms of gatherings are even possible during a time like this. Is digital intimacy even possible, like what Eugene was mentioning, right? So I think we are trying to also reveal the gaps currently, and I think the whole point of looking at that is also to really relook at how we do things. Whether it's collectives, whether it's individual artists, whether it's organizations, how do we actually in a way practice the values that we speak of? Yeah, so I think this whole transition has really brought this to the fore for us. Yeah, so that's
Right. I mean, I mean, it's great that, the artists, or rather the panelists, have sort of like unpacked and, expanded this notion of traveling. I just want to come back again. The fact that the overarching idea of this sort of panel discussion is about a meeting in progress. Maybe we can start with Shubigi. What are some of your respective strategies in moving forward for the time being in dealing with the pandemic? Yeah.
Strategies concerning my practice.
Your practice, yes, exactly. Yeah.
That's a funny one, because I really feel like a lot of projects are in limbo, and I'm particularly worried about one. It was actually my first feature-length film that I was working on, and it's a source of a lot of worry to me because I don't see an end in sight. I don't see how things are going to improve enough, because it's multiple shoots in locations that there's no way I'll be able to manage. Part the problem also is that travel isn't as simple as it once was. We have to factor in a lot of other things. Because if you're doing it very simply put, with the budget, you have to, you're using a pre-COVID budget. Institutions, even if they defer your funding, they need to recognize that pre-COVID budgets don't apply anymore. They don't take into account days of being quarantined or stay-home orders or so on. They don't take into account increased insurance costs, and there are lots of other costs that have changed. So just at a very basic level, a financial level, the whole project has to be reworked, right? So that's one. Of course, that's also taking into account the fact that there is a real risk that even when you travel, it's possible to get stuck there. So contingencies now have a whole other different meaning. And if you work the way I do, which is a very unfortunate way of working, where I do things back to back and very often overlapping, I don't have the bandwidth or the space to actually take on or continue my projects the way I used to at breakneck pace. I actually have to plan for the possibility that that things can go terribly wrong, and that I would need a month in between projects to just be buffers for things like everything from 14-day quarantines and so on. So I think that there's going forward, I mean, I just sort of scrubbed clean my schedule. And mind you, I had my schedule packed till 2024. So there's a lot that went haywire. The thing is that it's also the nature of my practice. Pulp 3 was due actually in 2020. I had decided to defer it because of Kochi. But for me, the act of writing isn't as simple as sitting and at a laptop and just writing all night. I need to travel to be able to write, because that's where the research is. And because I couldn't do that, I had this frustrating experience of sitting at home for most of 2020 and being unable to write because I didn't have the material. So I don't know when that's going to generate. So it means my entire 10-year project, which was so carefully planned, is in jeopardy. So very honestly, I am a little bit freaked out about some of those projects. At the same time, I also do like these sort of challenges because I'm at the middle age stage of the project. I'm smack dab in the middle of it. It's the 5-year bit. And it's a time that you tend to slump also, because you've now gotten used to a certain way of working. So I'm glad in a way that now I'm suffering a little bit about it because it means that I'm forced to come up with new strategies and new ways of thinking. And the first, of course, is that I've always shot solo. Like I'm always the person who meets people, and I don't have anyone else. I don't use a crew or anything at all. I may have to now change this. I may need to have sort of filming by proxy, where I get people at that location to actually film for me. And it's a form of working that I'm really not comfortable with, but I'm going to have to try. So there are artistic strategies that are possible. I think at the same time, it really depends on the nature of your artistic practice. I do think it's good to dial it back a bit and also center yourself on just one or two important projects that you might be doing, rather than just taking on everything and saying, okay, I can manage this. I think it's in that respect, I'm actually glad that I won't be frantically doing everything that I think I should.
Right. How about you, Alecia? Especially, I mean, I'm just thinking about the residency program.
Yeah, actually, I found in some ways there's so many common threads, right, with what Shubigi was sharing, because the project Uberuma in Bintan was meant to start last year in April, so right smack at our lockdown, right? So we literally had to cancel flights for some of the artists who were participating in our project. So actually, I think now it's in terms of strategies, right? One thing we're doing in this pause is actually to work on a digital archive. So not only the artists are now stranded in their respective countries, even the collaborators, myself and Ernest, also in different places at the moment, right? So we are all working remotely. So in a way, we are starting with our own personal artist studios as a starting point. Yeah, so we're working on a website right now to sort of kick off the research, and we're looking at Jules Masso's archive, because he's done a lot of research on Bintan. So we're sort of going back actually. So I think this comes back in terms of strategies, right? To think about what is really essential travel. Yeah, because that's something that we were also reflecting upon. I mean, the fact that we can't move, instead of being paralyzed by that, right? We're thinking also, how can we still be in contact with the artists, having dialogue with them, but at the same time also give us the luxury of thinking through these things. Yeah, so we're stretching things out a bit more.
How about Eugene?
I think previously I was very much like Shubigi, where I did everything myself until recently. 2 years ago, I started employing people and becoming a studio with like three, four staff members. So I think that really took some getting used to. I didn't like that at first. Like, I wanted to do everything myself, but after I got used to letting go of certain things and letting them do it, I think I never look back. So now I don't think I can work alone again. And now with like so many projects, I would agree with Shubigi. I'll be more selective with projects moving forward. People would think that, oh, because of COVID, got less projects, but I am actually drowning, and I want to spend more time with people I love, my family, my girlfriend. I look forward to next month where there will be less projects, and I'll be selecting less projects to do also.
Right. I think perhaps this is a great time to also move towards the questions that have been sort of submitted on Slido. There's a few, but I'm not sure whether we can take all of them. But one of the questions is basically there now seems to be more digital events connecting regional artists. How can we ensure that we don't forget about these closer connections in the future? Yeah. Alecia, what's your thoughts on that?
How do we ensure that we don't forget about these closer connections?
Right. I suppose this question seemed to be directing on the fact that we don't forget the physical connections in the future. Yeah.
I mean, the way I really see it is there really is no replacement for materiality, right, or the physical presence. So I think one good way is to really not think of them as replacing each other. So we got to really think of it as almost distinct phases. Yeah, I found that quite helpful for myself because I also participated in a couple of these sort of digital like workshops in some ways, which were some of them which were quite long, like over like a month, or quite intensively for a week. So there were different formats, and I felt that those programs, right, were actually very generative for me. I mean, it was exhausting for the eyes, but I did make contact with a lot of people who I never had chance to cross paths with. Also because previously when the same program was held, when travel was possible, it was usually limited to a very small group. But because it was digital, they were able to open it up to more participants, and I was able to join it. So I think in a way, it allows us to do a little bit of the research of different practices. So I imagine that, when the time comes when we're able to actually travel, it really has allowed for the first step to be made. We've actually had a chance to speak online. Yeah.
Eugene, what are your thoughts about the question? Do you feel that digital events, which has been connecting regional artists, right? Like moving forward, do we feel that we don't need the physical connections?
No, I think it still doesn't replace, like what Alecia said. It still doesn't replace the physical connection. Like if you were to ask me to just Zoom my girlfriend all the time, I think cannot.
Okay, maybe we can fit in perhaps one more question. Maybe I can pose this to Shubigi. The question goes: it seems that historically there has been this romantic, idealized idea of the traveling artist, Nanyang artists in particular. Is this now outdated?
Again, let's remember the Nanyang artists were people who had the means to do so. Again, also men in particular. So again, with the privilege and the ability to freely travel. So I'm not wholly sure that historically it should be the only example we look at, but it is a very telling example. I think that yes, working virtually or digitally has definitely leveled the playing field, I think, as everyone is kind of attested to that. But I also worry a bit about the intellectual and artistic, but also the social and the psychological support now also moving online. So I think that the romanticism that occurs very often after the fact. For people who have had the luck and they're able to travel, they know, they can attest the fact that it definitely is important. It makes a difference. I think we've spoken a bit about, and I've also alluded to the fatigue that comes along with especially curatorial travel, right, and also doing back-to-back projects as an artist. But I think we should also address digital fatigue. And okay, it's hard to romanticize digital fatigue, but it's something I think we're all experiencing now. There's our ability to actually process information, but also our ability to really connect with people is not, how would I say? There are things that, yes, they may have been romanticized earlier, but I don't think we can rely fully on moving, online. I think we do some of that romanticism, while it sounds really sickly sweet, has basis in the simple fact that travel can be transformative. Sometimes you don't realize it till way after the fact. And I think it's also necessary that when you look at the way information is consumed, we're all creating our intellectual silos. And COVID has reinforced that. We're all fed on a diet of information that is algorithmically decided, because our information is not largely coming to us through online sources. And I think that again we are sort of narrowing our fields of inquiry. We are narrowing our social interactions. Our psychological forms of support have shrunk. All of these are going to have repercussions which we won't see straight away. I also think it's very telling that almost every panel is going to address COVID while we're still in the midst of it. So we don't have that distance yet to fully process what's actually happening and the damage it's causing to a lot of ways of thinking, working, but also the stability of some of the more vulnerable people. So people who've been on the fringe or have struggled for a while in the art world are now pushed right over that edge. I think there is very little to romanticize here. I think that when we talk about travel, it might become a necessity sometimes to move out of a rut, which will definitely be something we'll see happen, I think, in the next couple of years, when you realize that people have actually stagnated or stultified, and also there's a lot of anxiety, and that sort of creates a double whammy of a hesitancy to travel, a hesitancy to experience things that might be outside our easy sort of form of interaction, which is what is mediated through Zoom and other online platforms. So I think we may need to argue for the necessity of travel in a short couple of years.
Right. I think thank you so much to the panelists for that very insightful response. Thank you, Shubigi at home. We hope you feel better. Yeah. All right. And thank you, Alecia and Eugene, for today. And for those tuning in at home, thank you for making time. And those who are in the audience, thank you again.
Thank you for coming for Festival Forum Meeting in Progress at the National Gallery, Singapore. Please remain seated. Our ushers will be guiding you row by row to the exit. Thank you.